Hello, everyone, and welcome to this book talk event here at the European Centre for Populism Studies. Today's talk is entitled Homegrown Hate, Why White Nationalists and Militant Islamists Are Waging War Against the US, based on Dr. Sara Kamali's book of the same name. So we're joined today by Dr. Kamali, who will be in conversation with Dr. Todd Green. Dr. Kamali is a senior fellow at the Centre for Analysis of the Radical Right. She's an author, a holistic justice activist, and a scholar of systemic inequities, white nationalism, and militant Islamism. Her work examines how interlocking institutions of power oppress the many while maintaining systems of privilege for a select few. Dr. Green he's also a former advisor on Islamophobia in Europe at the US State Department in Washington, D.C. His views on Islamophobia have been featured in a variety of media outlets, including CNN, NPR, and The Washington Post. He's the author of two books on Islamophobia. Firstly, The Fear of Islam, an introduction to Islamophobia in the West. And secondly, Presumed Guilty, Why We Shouldn't Ask Muslims to Condemn Terrorism. So the format of today's event will be as follows. Firstly, Dr. Green will introduce the book, highlighting some of its themes and its relation to current events. That will be followed by a discussion between her and Dr. Green, lasting for about 25 to 30 minutes. We might then hear a short excerpt from the book, and we'll conclude with a Q&A lasting about 20 minutes. So as usual, I've talked for far too much. So without further ado, I'll hand over to the speakers.
Thank you, Dylan. Thanks for having me here. I'm looking forward to the conversation today with Dr. Kamali about her new book, Homegrown Hate. I thought maybe I could spend just a very short amount of time here at the beginning to briefly introduce the main themes of the book, wrestling with the question of why Dr. Kamali's book is so significant at this particular historical and political moment, why it's not only are its themes important that she covers, but why it's so timely as well. And there are several points I want to make here in terms of reading this book that I think would be significant for a new audience to this. First, I believe Dr. Kamali's book, Homegrown Hate, helps to contextualize something that's quite significant in the year 2021 in the United States, and that's the January 6th attacks on the US Capitol. Her book obviously was in press by the time that those attacks happened, but much of the history leading up to January 6th is really dealt with quite adequately, not just adequately, but quite compellingly in this book. She addresses the history of white nationalist leaders, white nationalist groups, manifestos in the United States, gives some broader context to the anti-government and religious beliefs within white nationalism, and the role of conspiracy theories and disinformation among white nationalists as well, all of which are quite significant for understanding how the US Capitol came to be attacked on January 6th, and how this event in many ways didn't come out of nowhere, right? There is a very particular history leading up to it, and this book will help provide context for that. Another point to mention is that this is a book in which Dr. Kamali addresses all the basic questions about white nationalism, the who, what, when, where, why, and how of white nationalism in the United States and its transnational features. She discusses the influential white nationalist ideologies and groups, both in the past and the present. She analyzes the political grievances of and the aims of white nationalists, the religious and conspiracy theory beliefs among white nationalists, the weaponization of social media and disinformation among white nationalists, and broadly speaking, white nationalist terrorist incidents throughout American history, again, providing that rich context that's often missing in contemporary analyses of white nationalist movements. Dr. Kamali's book helps us understand why a disproportionate number of white nationalists can be found in the armed forces, in the military, and law enforcement agencies. Her reflections on this topic can help us better understand why current and former military and law enforcement representatives were disproportionately represented among the white nationalists who were arrested or who've been charged for the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. Dr. Kamali also conducts a rigorous, timely examination of the multifaceted platform of white nationalist hate. In many ways, it intersects with a variety of prejudices, including anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, misogyny, racism, and queerphobia. Dr. Kamali addresses how and why the white nationalist platform is becoming intertwined with the Republican Party, how really some of the fundamental building blocks of the contemporary Republican Party depend on white nationalist rhetoric, sometimes explicit, other times implicit. Dr. Kamali also promotes policies at the end of her book, particularly to address the scourge of white nationalist hate. So there's a very practical component to this book that's compelling as well. She's specifically interested in a new comprehensive national security framework that she calls holistic justice, and that will effectively and comprehensively address the full scope of the white nationalist threat, which she argues is the greatest threat that the United States currently faces. As for me, as a scholar of Islamophobia, I want to say just a couple things about why I have interest in this book and very much have interest in this conversation. As someone who studies Islamophobia for a living, I am interested in Dr. Kamali's book because it brings to the fore a narrative that I believe is crucial to understanding America's past and present, and that is the narrative of violent, hostile, white supremacists and white extremists, who in turn have been fueled by a long history of racism, institutionalized in American history and institutions. Muslims in the United States, in many cases, as in Europe, are all too often singled out by politicians, law enforcement and intelligence agencies, and media outlets as being particularly prone to extremism and violence. The result has been the securitizing of Muslim populations through racist policies that treat Muslims by default as deserving of suspicion, exclusion, discrimination, or worse. In this environment, Muslims become foils over against which white populations on both sides of the Atlantic can define national identities. As long as the dominant narrative involves menacing and malicious Muslims, those of us, people like me with my racial and religious background, need not come to terms with our own violent past and our ongoing complicity in a violent and oppressive world order. By fixating on Muslims as existential threats to Western values and nations, white Christian Americans and Europeans are distracted from the racism that undergirds their own national histories and that fuels horrific violence and intolerance, including, but not limited to, the January 6th attacks in the US Capitol that I've already mentioned. So this narrative, this dominant narrative of peaceful, tolerant white Americans and Christians and Europeans on one hand, and violent, intolerant Muslims on the other hand, needs to be challenged, it needs to be subverted, and it needs to be corrected. And I believe Dr. Kamali's book helps to do this by shedding light on a narrative that only recently is getting serious attention among some politicians and journalists, but that otherwise has been neglected to the point that Muslim lives and livelihoods have suffered significantly. So let me begin the conversation with Dr. Kamali by thanking her for writing this book, for telling the story of white nationalists and extremist hate and violence in the United States. Dr. Kamali, let's turn our attention now and focus a little bit more on the core elements that we find in Homegrown Hate. Many media pundits and politicians wouldn't actually readily see a connection between white nationalist and militant Islamists. Yet you have written a book that actually seeks to tie these two groups together. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you do this? What is the common denominator between these two groups within the United States? And what do most people not understand about the common forces that drive white nationalists and militant Islamists?
Thank you so much, Dr. Green. Before I respond to your thoughtful question, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge and thank both Dr. Zahra Cholak and Dylan Price for their kind invitation, as well as, of course, your gracious introduction, and let the audience know that I'm looking forward to our discussion. So please feel free to keep note of your questions and comments, and we look forward to speaking with you soon. Yes, so regarding the reason for the comparison, the book was always meant to be a comparative study. And the reason for that is because comparison really highlights, of course, the common denominators, but also very much the differences. And as you so rightly pointed out, our work is quite complementary in that Islamophobia is is very much weaponized as a political tool, not only by white nationalists, but also by militant Islamists. And so as a scholar of terrorism and as a student of terrorism and as an observer, a human being, witnessing the geopolitical landscape, particularly post 9/11, to see how militant Islamists and Muslim Americans were very different from each other, being treated in essentially the same way, and having white nationalists being overlooked, dismissed, and minimized. I wanted to essentially it was only right to discuss both in order to bring to light the vagaries and systemic oppression that Muslim Americans face, whilst also discussing the scope of the militant Islamist threat, which is a threat transnationally, but not necessarily within the United States, not necessarily within North America, and in not necessarily within North America, particularly as we're finding out now, 20 years after 9/11. And then really what we can see as the similarities is that there is definitely a sense of victimhood, a narrative of victimhood that is very much propelled by US policy, whether that be domestic with regard to white nationalists, or whether that be foreign policy with regard to militant Islamists. And what is often left out of the conversation is how religion in particular, and how beliefs that may not necessarily be subscribed to how religion is generally conceived of, but even, for example, the 14 words, or the religions that support white supremacy, which is the kernel within white nationalism, such as Christian identity, such as even militant Mormonism or Latter-day Saints, or even white evangelicalism, for example. So between white nationalism, militant Islamism, there's not only a narrative of victimhood, but there's also the usage of religion and beliefs in order to justify violence. Of course, there are a lot of differences, but in terms of wanting a territory, whether that be a white ethno-state or a caliphate, that's very often justified by a certain set of beliefs that dictate that both ideologies are essentially under attack and threat of extinction, if not genocide.
Thank you for that. You, in the book, express really strong views concerning the use of the word jihad in political discourse to describe violence carried out by militant Islamists. Can you say a little bit more about why you think it's inappropriate to use the word jihad in this context, and why you prefer the language and the jargon of militant Islamists instead of jihadis?
Yes, I would really love to hear your thoughts too. So hopefully we'll have a little time to get your input on this. And I think it might be helpful for the audience and those who watch in the future. Well, as many Muslims themselves will tell you, jihad is not does not equate holy war. There are other terms like qital in the Quran, and then also what the language does that is co-opted by militant Islamists is essentially claim that there is an intrinsic religious link that mandates violence, that is the quote unquote true Islam by militant Islamists. So essentially my using the terms militant Islamism really changes the dynamic and the paradigm in order to focus on the politicization of religion, not and disqualifies and nullifies the argument that there is something inherent within religion, specifically Islam itself, that is violent, as you pointed out within when discussing your work. And it's really important as well, terminology. And I get this argument a lot that, well, it's quite academic and why do you spend so much time talking about it? But words matter. And using the term jihad and using the term jihadi, for example, is, I think, quite negating of the Muslim American experience and really reduces Muslims around the world. There are estimated to be 2 billion Muslims around the world. And that essentially links them and only sees them through, and erroneously through, the lens of a religion which is thought to be violent or even reduced to a cult. So I'm very particular and intentional about the language I use, even when it comes to white nationalism versus white supremacy, for example. And essentially words matter, and they really shape our framework of understanding. And I really would be curious. I mean, I'm going to throw that question back to you, but I really would like to encourage the audience to think about what they think about the term jihadi, for example, and even militant Islamism or some alternative phrasing. I'm very curious to engage with you later. Dr. Green?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree with you. I think the tendency in so-called Western nations is to sort of link any kind of violence that might be perpetrated by people with a Muslim background automatically to religion in a way that would not take place if it were someone who looked like me or had my cultural or racial or religious background, right? I wouldn't, Dylan Roof was not called a crusader. Anders Breivik was not called a crusader as such, right? I mean, there are other explanatory factors and frameworks that come to play in trying to explain violence carried out by people with a white or white Christian background that would not be the case with Muslims. And some of this has been ingrained in Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations framework, right? That Western nations are too enlightened for that kind of violence. Our violence is much more noble and for good reasons and not for religion, whereas for Muslims it must have to do with religion. And that's a fundamental misunderstanding of religion. Any mainstream religion scholar recognizes that religious traditions can be instrumentalized in terms of ideologies for violence or for peace, right? But that religions aren't organically one or the other. But the way the discourse takes place, it's very simplistically rooting this in something about religion. As a religion scholar, I would simply add that that's the wrong question to ask, right? It's is this or isn't it about religion? The question really to ask is, why do such a small number of people with a Muslim background carry out such violence, whereas the vast majority do not? As you and I have talked about before, why is it that Malala Yousafzai and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi read the same sacred text and end up leading radically different lifestyles and different positions on violence, right? That's a more interesting question than is Islam prone to violence. But the language of jihadis, jihadi and jihadism, whatever, automatically reduces it to something about religion in a very simplistic way that it extricates from larger political and social factors. And I think you do a very compelling job in your book of highlighting those factors and reminding your audiences and your readers that religious traditions don't exist in a social, cultural, historical, or political vacuum, right? They're always intertwined with these traditions, and we can't understand militant Islamism apart from that, any more than we can understand white nationalism apart from these larger contexts. So yeah, thank you for your thoughts on that.
And hence the need for comparison,
yes,
as well, and the utility of comparison, I think, which I also do, of course, discuss in the introduction. Right. It's interesting that you bring up the examples juxtaposing Malala Yousafzai with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, because the question is also an additional question would be, why is it that Islam is perceived as an inherently violent religion, whereas the many religions associated and even belief systems associated within white nationalism or associated with white nationalism are not necessarily seen as inherently violent. For example, what I call white nationalist evangelicalism. So we have white evangelicalism, but then there are white adherents, and then there are also people of color, and there is a lot of tension and consternation amongst people of color who are part of the evangelical church, who are perhaps redefining or reevaluating, and also not leaving the church, but finding their own niche within evangelicalism. Whereas white evangelicals, white nationalist evangelicals specifically, are being co-opted and more aligned with QAnon, as has been the case since about 2016. So again, back to your point, really, that there's a certain paradigm, certain lens through which Islam specifically is seen, rather than as a multitude of expressions in the heterogeneity. It's just seen as a homogeneously violent belief system, often reduced again to a cult. And the reason I'm saying that is because that's very much lobbied by white nationalists themselves, that Islam's not a religion, it's a cult, it's, you know, dogmatic and violent. And then again, you have that kind of propaganda leveraged by militant Islamists themselves that use Islamophobia as a tool to justify their narrative of victimhood, and also their use of violence. And that's not to dilute really the full scope of the platforms and the grievances, but it is an interesting dynamic, I think, that's worth pointing out.
Oh, absolutely, and even beyond white nationalists, right? When violence with perpetrated by someone who might have a Muslim background gets reduced to the language of jihadism or jihadi, right? All Muslims become suspects, right? Jihad has something to do with Islam. If you are a Muslim, you are now an object of suspicion, and the idea even goes oftentimes implicitly and more mainstream political discourse that, you know, you're deserving of suspicion, of discrimination, of surveillance, profiling, all sorts of things get justified under this rubric because this must have something to do with religion, and this is what all Muslims must share in common, right? That it's a form of racializing of a religious community that comes a way of justifying the violation of civil liberties and all sorts of other horrible things that can happen, including discrimination and violence against Muslim populations.
And of course, the demographics of Muslims in Europe are going to be different than the demographics of Muslims within the United States and in Australasia, for example, or where there is this tension between white nationalists and militant Islamists, for example. But what I also find interesting is very often left out of the debates that are global currently with regard to carceral reform and specifically to do with Black lives, is that Muslims who are Black are often left out of the conversation as well. And not all Muslims are Black and brown. On the other hand, you know, they're also white Muslims. So there are issues of colorism, not only within Muslim communities around the world, but then also to do with looking at, you know, skin color justice or racism. I think it's really important to also be able to link white nationalism with Black Muslims, brown Muslims, and then understand that Muslims themselves also need to look within and see how there can be some sort of allyship with white passing Muslims, for example, to support and advocate. And again, I really hope we can talk to the audience about that, because it's something I've lived in Europe for a long time. A lot of my adult life, in fact. And so I would love to be able to talk to the audience about those kinds of dynamics, particularly within the Muslim communities as they see it. Because of course, France right now, for example, is struggling with Black and brown Muslims specifically, you know. So just pointing these things out as we go along.
Oh, thank you for that. I want to turn to another topic in your book. I mean, talk a lot about terrorism. The word terrorism, as you know, can be a loaded word. I actually think it is a loaded word. I don't think it's an objective word. In a lot of, again, political discourse on both sides of the Atlantic, the word oftentimes is almost exclusively applied to individuals and organizations with a real or perceived Muslim identity who carry out acts of violence that target civilians. And for this reason, there are some scholars and activists who think we should abandon the term altogether. And I want to know what your position is on this debate. Can the word terrorism, the language of terrorism, be redeemed and salvaged in any meaningful way, so that it's no longer racialized or intertwined with Islamophobic assumptions?
Well, Well, it can only no longer be racialized or intertwined with Islamophobic assumptions if it is also applied to white nationalists specifically. And because of the white privilege you were speaking about earlier, to do with your own background in particular, uh, there's often a reticence to apply pejorative labels such as terrorism, or even something stronger than a mob or a riot, for example, to explain the insurrection, which was deemed to be an actual terrorist event by some in federal law enforcement agencies and national security agencies. So it's interesting, even if we look at the example of the language around January 6th specifically, we can see that the label terrorism doesn't necessarily apply, but it very much, it doesn't apply within the media discourse, even though it very much fits the definition, which is simply political violence, violence in the pursuit of political aims. In this case, it was a political aim of a white ethno-state, for which the election of Donald Trump, which was thought to be wrongly, his victory was thought to be wrongly taken from him, hence the Stop the Steal event that preceded the insurrection. And we can see how that disparity in language comes to play specifically with that event, and also how it has been part and parcel of our global dialogue when it comes to terrorism, not only within national security and law enforcement, but also very definitely within the media. And now, 20 years later, 20 years later, many generations, in fact, later, just because of the way the generational divide is now, after 9/11, we can see that terrorism, the link between terrorism and Islam, is essentially taken for granted and not even up for inquiry anymore. So by using terrorism very deliberately, again, very intentionally within Homegrown Hate, I very much wanted to reclaim the word and also reapply it meaningfully in order to counterbalance the systemic inequities within the current counterterrorism paradigm that's very much still focused on a post 9/11 paradigm, even though the reality needs to be shifted to a post 1/6 framework to acknowledge the full scope of the white nationalist threat.
Dr. Kamali, what do you think explains the Islamophobia that drives much of the current counterterrorism paradigm in the United States? Yeah, it almost goes without saying for people who study this, right?
Yeah.
The government and many high-ranking officials in the government intelligence agencies, they have fixated largely on Muslim populations, suspect populations, and given white nationalists and supremacists and right-wing groups a pass, one could say at the very least, or put it this way: a decade ago, Representative Peter King of New York was hosting on Capitol Hill in the United States, was hosting hearings on Muslim radicalization. There was no hearing on white nationalist radicalization or white supremacist radicalization. And in my sense is that's not an accident, right? Why do you think it is? Why have many government entities not focus their attention and their efforts and their resources, financial and human resources as well, on white nationalist threats in the way that they have on people with a Muslim background?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And for more background on this, I'm not going to say read the book for everything, but that's very much explained in the book, just if people want more context on this. And there's a reason why there are significant number of notes, is because I wanted people to have a resource and use this as a most comprehensive resource on white nationalism, militant Islamism today, and also have notes to go back to if they wanted to look it up, various topics that will interest them. Yeah, that's a really great point. So as we can see, even with the refusal to go forward with a January 6th commission, which would be a bipartisan commission investigating the full scope of the January 6th attack, including which factors led up to the attack itself, which would most likely implicate members of the current Republican Party, current and past members of the Republican Party. We can see also that Islam as a religion, despite its multitude of expressions around the world, has always been excluded from the Judeo-Christian paradigm that has underlined the way that the United States has essentially viewed itself through education, through media, through government, through policies, etc. Even though Muslims themselves first came to the United States, or not came to were forcibly brought to the United States as enslaved people. And so the history of Islam within the United States has been concomitant with the foundation and the development and successive United States in many ways. Muslim Americans have contributed greatly to the United States as we know it, and would very often argue that they are indeed part of the Judeo-Christian lineage of the United States and framework. So of course, there is an Islamophobia component to current counterterrorism paradigm. There's also been an Islamophobia component to the perception of Muslims as the other. And unfortunately, that goes for a lot of various groups, including the people who were here before, the many indigenous tribes and nations before America was taken over, essentially, and has become what it is today. So I speak a lot about history, and it's not necessarily relearning history the way that we've learned it, but it's very important to understand the different groups, how different groups and how whiteness, for example, is a fluid identity. But Muslims have always, even white Muslims, for example, have always been excluded from being understood as white, being accepted as part of that skin color category, and have always been denied the privilege that whiteness affords, legally speaking, as well as socially speaking, for example. So it's really important that we understand when we're trying to understand and grapple with Islamophobia today, that we also understand Islamophobia within the scope of the multitude of oppressions of marginalized people, or people who have been marginalized and minoritized throughout American history, including the present day. And of course, I'm going to throw the question back to you as a scholar and expert of Islamophobia.
Okay. Well, no, thanks for your response to that. I think a couple of things come to mind. First, that domestic counterterrorism programs are always linked to foreign policy as well, and in the case of the United States for sure. So that when the United States is engaged in a war on terror, a global war on terror, Muslim populations abroad are being targeted. And to that extent, then Muslim populations at home become symbolic stand-ins for the perceived Muslim enemy abroad, and they must be treated accordingly. It's not a new dynamic in American history. I think that the most obvious one that comes to my mind, and historically, would be the internment of Japanese Americans in the Second World War, right? Japanese Americans became symbolic stand-ins in terms of the enemy for the Japanese enemy that was the Japanese Empire, right? Which was part of who the United States was at war with. And so all of a sudden, all Japanese Americans become suspect for that reason. And a similar, and it's not identical, but a very similar dynamic is at work with the way Muslim populations now are securitized. In fact, that dynamic is close enough to the point that the Supreme Court was actually debating those very connections when it was hearing the case about the Trump administration, Trump versus Hawaii, in terms of the Muslim ban that was enacted in 2017. By the Trump administration, whether there's actually a correlation and overlap with the treatment of Japanese Americans earlier in our history. So there's that factor. But then the broader question, I think, is then what's driving all of that? And this is going to sound provocative, but I firmly believe that what's driving that is empire, U.S. empire, U.S. imperialism, the United States wanting to maintain it's a secure position at the top of a global political order. And to do so, it must manage certain populations that are perceived or constructed to be existential threats to the larger imperial ambitions of the United States. And since the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union, Muslim populations and or Muslim organizations have been deemed as the most significant threats to U.S. imperial ambitions in the way that the Soviet Union was prior prior to that. And to that extent, Muslims at home, Muslim Americans, have been incorporated into the security apparatus, the national security apparatus in that way, because they are perceived to be obstacles to these larger imperial ambitions. So to that extent, you have counterterrorism programs effectively targeting Muslim populations in the United States for that reason, in a way that, again, white nationalists are seen as aberrations to America, maybe, but they're not seen as threats to larger U.S. imperial ambitions in the same way as Muslims are. And there's all sorts of reasons that have to do with racism, because a lot of U.S. imperialism, as historically European imperialism, is intertwined with racism and racializing other populations in order to justify the larger imperial project.
And it's exactly why also that the comparative framework lends itself to tease out those themes and to also bring different spotlights on exactly those themes that you described. So I think that's the points of comparison as well as similarities are very important to understand the full scope of not only the national security threats as they are posed by both white nationalists and militant Islamists around the world, but to also understand why they are positioned the way they are and why we think what we think about the threats in terms of how we are taught to think about them by not only the national security agencies and bodies, but also then by the media itself.
No, fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if I can ask one more question before we maybe transition into your reading from the book. You argue at the end of the book that we need a new approach to counterterrorism, and you refer to this as a holistic justice approach. Can you just briefly say a little bit more about what you mean by holistic justice and why you insist that a holistic justice approach must move beyond anti-racism and anti-oppression to counter the threats by white nationalists in the United States?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Green. So holistic justice moves beyond anti-racism to anti-oppression, and not only to counter white nationalism, but also to combat the Islamophobia that's inherent within our national security paradigm. It's also inherent within many countries' national security paradigm. So it's not necessarily it's applicable to many nations beyond the United States. Holistic means comprehensive. It's nothing to do with naturopathy or homeopathy, as some people have asked me before. And justice means justice. So essentially what we're working towards when we talk about equity. So with a holistic justice framework, there are several components and several aims. So the first aim is to dismantle the Islamophobia within national security frameworks. It's also to promote equity, not only along skin color lens, but also along the many facets of identities. So looking at many minoritized identities, as Dr. Green mentioned about the book in the introduction. And it's also to bring awareness, attention, and most importantly, funds to redress white Islamophobia, but also address white nationalism. And even though there been within the current within the present moment, the Biden administration, President Biden himself, as well as several cabinet secretaries, have indeed acknowledged that white nationalism is the greatest domestic terrorist threat, but it's also a transnational threat that also needs to be acknowledged. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's programming, education, or funding towards understanding white nationalism, or even towards countering the threat fully within these agencies. So holistic justice works on various levels. Not only does it work on the federal level in order to enact a legislation that essentially will implement a review board to understand the full scope of white nationalism within the various agencies, but also to implement and administer funds towards understanding and also keeping tabs on the threat with full transparency. So as we've seen currently within the current paradigm that very much criminalizes Muslims specifically and Black and brown people more generally, we can see that this is all being done through surveillance practices and policies, and through fusion centers, and through combined networks such as joint terrorism task forces, but many people often don't know about these. So really, holistic justice is also calling for transparency, as well as certain pieces of legislation to be enacted. At the state level, in the United States, it's at the state level in which the curriculum is developed for public schools, and public means state schools in the UK. And we really need to reframe our education. So there's currently a backlash within the United States in relation to critical race theory, and any type of education to do with teaching about racism in the context of how the construct of race came to be, and also how racism has been weaponized as a political tool for power and imperialism, as you were mentioning before, Dr. Green. We can see that there's been a backlash, but really what needs to happen at the state level is that all of these minoritized identities really need to be discussed within the context of the state, wherever that is geographically, in local context, and also understood within the context of American history and global history. It's not really until we understand how race is a socio-political and historical construct that we will be able to dismantle it. And it's not until we understand how racism is a tool to be weaponized in the pursuit of upholding a certain imperialist strain that we will be able to combat it effectively. And it's really only through learning, not only through textbooks, but also experiential learning. And that's really brings the component of anti-oppression. So there's empathy in terms of understanding historically and experientially, but then there's also anti-oppression, which is really calling for solidarity amongst minoritized groups on the ground. So we have federal legislation, state education, and then grassroots organizations, whether that be people who consider themselves activists, nonprofit, public sector organizations that are really focused on combating white nationalism within local contexts. What we very often see, and what's very often left out of the media discourse today, which again shapes our own understanding, is that we have the Black people fighting for their rights and struggling for their rights, and then brown people, and then there seems to be very disparate categories, but that's really not necessarily what's happening on the ground. So holistic justice is calling for solidarity amongst minoritized groups in order to effectively address white nationalism, white nationalist hate within their local context. And that is of course what the conclusion is devoted to. So I think it's very important that not only should there be a push within public sphere to pressurize governments for legislative justice, but there also should very much be a focus on the ground within local communities in order to advance justice at home.
Thank you for that. I think we had thought about taking this opportunity to read an excerpt from your book before we go into a Q&A.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Thank you. So this is from the conclusion, and really just speaks to the themes that we discussed, as well as the ideas of coming together. And I think very often today, given the political divisiveness that is very often found in many countries, many places, many towns around the world, we're not only divided along political lines, but along so many different identities that we're very often I think it's very often to dehumanize people we don't consider the same as us. And I think that's really the underlying message of holistic justice. It's not really until we respect and recognize our common humanity that we will be able to counter any type of hate, and specifically white nationalist terrorism. E pluribus unum, recognizing our common humanity. Ours is a crucial period for the homeland security, economic prosperity, and social stability of the United States. The distances across identities, including religious, socioeconomic, and political strata, have never seemed more expansive. The United States has always been replete with contradictions, simultaneously calling for liberty while taking away the freedom of its citizens, espousing equity while minoritizing Black and Brown Americans, professing justice while institutionalizing asymmetrical oppression. And at present, the United States is teetering on the precipice of choice between light and dark, constructive and destructive, to empower all equitably or to bestow benefits upon only the few. For the religiously minded, God will judge. For the atheistic or agnostic, history is the ultimate arbiter. It is both a moral imperative and in our collective self-interest to make the choice to benefit from holistic justice, which is for all, rather than to wreak mutually assured destruction by collectively disavowing one another. In the final analysis, it is only by fully recognizing our common humanity that we will be able to strive toward mutual peace and prosperity on this planet we all share. So thank you so much, Dr. Green, and I appreciate your thoughtful questions. And I want to thank Dr. Cholak again for the invitation, and Dylan, thank you so much. And I'm very much looking forward to our conversation with the audience and any questions or comments they'd like to share.
Thank you very much for that. That was a wonderful talk and so rich and so much to discuss. If you have a question, please write something in the chat or raise a virtual hand, or indeed turn on your camera and raise on your real human hand, and we can come to you in turn. Just to kick things off, I mean, this is clearly incredibly rich work, and there's so many avenues we could go down here. Just something very general. Could you give us some general personal context for this study? How did you come to look at this topic specifically over other topics? Because there's so much you could discuss in this area.
So do you mean how did I come about to studying white nationalism specifically?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, really, in the post 9/11 landscape, I think I'm the last generation to vaguely remember what it was like to visit an airport. And I've said this before, but really the tenor of fear of the other, or fear specifically of Muslims, really drastically changed seemingly overnight. Within the Muslim American communities, but also directed toward Muslims around the world. And again, that's very often taken for granted now, but I really wanted to understand, and I was very fortunate to be able to work with Professor Paul Wilkinson at St. Andrews University, who was a founder of terrorism studies and work at the Center for Terrorism and Political Violence at St. Andrews as well. Really fortunate to work hands-on with these types of issues. But I initially, what prompted my interest was to understand the dynamics of how people I knew personally could then be portrayed to be portrayed as inherently violent towards their countries of citizenship. And that was something that led me on this journey. And then, of course, understanding history, and thankfully being someone who loves to read and explore and understand, knowing the dynamics of how enslaved people came to be in this country, as well as how race was weaponized. I understood that very early on. And so I think that naturally lent itself over time to comparison. So basically, this book is the culmination of a lot of my interest from childhood, but then a culmination of writing throughout my adult life. So there's a reason why the book is divided into 4 parts. There's a reason why it's perhaps on the longer side, and there's a reason why it took 10 plus years. Just a lot of thought.
Thank you for your question and for such thoughtful answers. We have a question in the chat, which I can read out. Firstly, thanking you for this interesting discussion, a sentiment which I'm sure we all share. The question is, what kind of role played by Donald Trump and Trumpists at large for normalizing white supremacism, white nationalism, Islamophobia, racism, far-right extremism, as seen in cases of QAnon, Proud Boys, Boogaloo Boys, etc., in the US and beyond the US, do you see? And could you please elaborate a little bit on that?
So who's the person?
This is Boulen Keynes.
Okay, so thank you so much for your question, Bulent. Yes, so certainly Donald Trump is often, his administration, his presidential administration is seen as inciting white nationalist violence, but I very much see it as harnessing the grievances that we're talking about. So not only anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, but the very many other grievances, including queerphobia. And as Dr. Green and I were just discussing with the previous question, that these grievances can be found within the context of history, not only within the United States, but also globally around the world. So we can see that very definitely, not only through Donald Trump specifically, not only through the rhetoric of Donald Trump specifically, but also through the policies of the Trump administration, that anti-Semitism, Islamophobia have essentially been leveraged and exploited and harnessed to gain followers, to gain political traction, and most certainly we've seen this with the rise of disinformation, and there's a reason why QAnon is the growth of the foundation of QAnon and the rise of QAnon is concomitant with President Donald Trump's administration.
Thank you for that question. We have another question in the chat. Yeah, Zara, do you want to read it?
Okay, another question from Marve Kayıkçı. So she says, thank you to both for the very interesting discussion. And she's curious to know your thoughts about the role of center-right and center-left in normalizing Islamophobic discourses, especially in countries like the Netherlands, where the far right is politically marginalized, but where liberal parties have also adopted anti-migrant, anti-Islamic discourses. So is it clear?
Thank you for the question, Merve. Dr. Green, would you like to discuss Islamophobia in terms of normal?
Yeah, my apologies. No, this is a great question. I think the very short answer is yes. Both center-right and center-left political parties, movements, individuals have contributed significantly to Islamophobia and the normalization of Islamophobia in a number of ways. I think what ties this on both sides of the Atlantic together is the investment of more liberal individuals and parties at times in counterterrorism initiatives and counter-violent extremism initiatives. You know, CVE we call it here, or PVE, or in the UK. But the Prevent program, for example, is not just some program that born out of the extreme far right. It's got a lot of investment in it across the political spectrum, or it has for a while at least. And this is a mainstream sort of political problem, right, on both sides of the Atlantic. So the securitizing of Muslim populations, treating Muslims as suspect populations, it's across the political spectrum that we have seen a lot of this taking place, and it's important to keep that in mind. And I think in the European context, it's significant because, as the questioner noted, you know, there is a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in Europe, and a lot of anxiety across Europe when it comes to immigrant populations, refugees. The larger question that influx of various populations pose for national identity and that sort of thing. And what you have seen are, again, politicians across the political spectrum signal caution when it comes to immigration policies. And keeping in mind that in a European context, more often than not, when there's a debate about immigration, there is almost always a debate about Muslims, explicitly or implicitly. those two get very much conflated in European context in a way that in the United States, immigrants, or the word immigrants, can have other connotations other than Muslims, but in European context, they get linked very closely. And the larger debates over multiculturalism. It was a couple of decades ago, the word multiculturalism in Europe was not really a bad word. It is now become a bad word in a lot of political discourse in many European countries, including the Netherlands and Germany and other places. And you have people from David Cameron in the UK to Angela Merkel in Germany who raise questions about multiculturalism and its value. And they're not engaged in an abstract intellectual or academic debate about what is multiculturalism and how we define it. But they are sending signals that they want to claim some notion of Germanness or Britishness or whatever that involves assimilating people of different racial, religious, and cultural backgrounds, as opposed to a lively exchange with a diversity. And so it's code language really for something that's much more Islamophobic. And that has been a movement that has swept across the political spectrum. And the final thing I will say in the United States, at least, is that if it were not for COVID, I think Donald Trump's main strategy for getting reelected in 2020 would have been to target Representative Ilhan Omar of the state of Minnesota, amongst others, but particularly Representative Omar, as the poster child, really, for all that's wrong with America because of her background as a Muslim, that she's Black, that she's a former refugee, Somali. She represents everything that was over against the kind of America that he was fighting for. The problem was on the left side of the political spectrum was that when Representative Omar oftentimes came under attack, the response of more liberal, democratic, mainstream politicians was often flat-footed, hesitant, equivocal, as if they were a bit embarrassed to be tied to Representative Omar. And that's classic democratic establishment politics in the United States. Not explicitly Islamophobic, but a little bit more implicitly so, in terms of wanting to keep their distance from very prominent, outspoken Muslim critics, politicians, and figures like Representative Omar or Representative Rashida Tlaib of Michigan.
And just to round off that point, the insightful commentary, thank you, Dr. Green. The pillars of people of color and or immigrants, essentially, are certainly also significant pieces of white nationalist grievances. So there's a section in the book where I discuss that and link that to, or discuss people of color and the grievances toward people of color, as well as the grievances toward immigrants, specifically within the context of the Great Replacement theory, within the context of the canon of white nationalist literature. Those ideas were also imported from Europe specifically, and European writers, and then also prevalent within the American context. And then, of course, we're seeing that in the present day, as well as historically within Australasia and other places where white nationalism has really taken hold.
Thank you for that question and your thoughtful answers. Does anyone else have a question that they would like to ask? We have a, yeah.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for such an interesting discussion, because it's been a while I haven't listened about the white supremacy. It's a, I think, rare area of discussion in the academia recently. I don't know. First of all, I appreciate your distinguishing the jihad and the general context, because it's very rare that when academics are initiating the discursive challenge, it's also challenging for themselves. For example, when you put a new word into your thesis or academic discussion or paper, people start to correct you when you say, for example, when you don't use the jihad, they say that it is the jihad you are trying to say or something. So it is very brave, I think, and it's quite nice to hear such challenges and discursive shifts in the academy. It's quite nice. And I wondered if, I don't know if it's in the discussion context of your book or not, but it was bugging me in the back of my mind when you were telling, is there how do you relate the Islamic populism and this white supremacy and Islamic militantism, because I always think that this Islamic populism is also fed by such discussions and also such rise of white supremacy or Islamophobia, because they used such kind of discourse. We know it from Turkey, for example, or different countries in the Middle East as well. Unfortunately, it's very popular. So how do you relate this? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, how do I pronounce your first name?
Dilek.
Dilek? Okay, thank you, Dilek, for taking the time. I know you just mentioned that you don't necessarily join in on these conversations very often, so I appreciate your time, and I know it's quite late there, so thank you for making the time to join in today, and also for your thoughtful question. Yes, very much so. So I, as I do discuss, and we previously just briefly touched upon this during the conversation, that white nationalism is certainly used as a tool by militant Islamists, and so too is the propagandizing of militant Islamism used by white nationalists. So there certainly is an interplay between the two. And it's very interesting too, because even if we look at the concept of the lone wolf, which is a whole chapter in and of itself, a lot of the language is actually co-opted by white nationalists from militant Islamists and vice versa. So I wouldn't necessarily say that they're the only, these two ideologies are the only kind of feed off each other entirely, but there are certain components that are exploited by each other in order to reify the sense of victimhood that both would like to portray in order to justify their violence. Do you have a follow-up question that I could perhaps answer?
The thing is that, for example, when I think about Islamic populism, Islamist populists as well, they refer a lot to Islamist militants as if they are totally different from each other. But I think, for example, in Turkey, we have a secular regime and etc. But I think Islamist populist discourse is always fed by these Islamic militants and also these white supremacists or Islamophobia. And it's like feeding the Islamic populace itself. So they are just making their way or arguments upon this background. So right. It is also like, yeah, interesting to see these linkages as well. Yeah, not only the white supremacists are fed by the Islamic militants, but also Islamic populists themselves making it way up. Yeah.
Yes, so militancy and the threat of Islam as violence will always essentially be leveraged for political purposes, I think. Dr. Green, do you have anything you'd like to add to that? At least as far as well, anything. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe the weaponization of Islamophobia in the context of Turkey.
Yeah, I mean, it is something that happens, right? You can see various political movements in some Muslim majority countries that try to weaponize Islamophobia in that way. And what broadly comes to mind is simply the fact that it all depends on how we define populism. But elements of what we think of as populism are global, right? They're not particular to Europe, not particular to the United States, right? We see variations of this from China to India, right? Myanmar to to the Netherlands, to Hungary, to the United States. So, I guess one larger question is, why is that? Why now? Why have these movements taken hold? In what ways are they different, right? In terms of how they leverage power or leverage certain kinds of narratives, and in what ways are they feeding again from similar impulses in terms of trying to construct national identity, usually over against some maligned minority that is perceived to be a threat to identity or maybe even a threat to power.
And quite frankly, it's the easiest way to do that. Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. We have time for a question from Erdem and then one from Zara, and then I think that will be all we have time for today. But yeah, over to you, Erdem.
Okay, my name is Erdem. I'm a PhD student at York University in Canada. So my question, well, I have one observation and two short questions. My first impression that I saw the title and the subtitle of the book was that, well, this book could be repeating that Islamophobic mantra, because when I look at the title, it's Hate, Islam, and Waging a War Against the United States. But I know how sensitive you are. You know, I've seen some other publications of you, and after this talk, I think the use of the term Islam should be quite, I think, well, carefully chosen. When I look at the consistency and the persistency of the use of Islamic State, quote unquote, in the media, and it's no longer in Western media, it's now in Chinese media, in Indian media as well. And I mean, Center for American Progress, I think about 10 years ago, published an extensive report. I'm sure that you are more than aware of that report, that they defined some Islamophobia misinformation experts in the Western media, spreading the use of Islam and the words which have negative connotations. And it's a kind of common, I think now, there are lots of common phrases, right? So it's a, well, words matter, as you indicated, and the use of those terms with such violent terms somehow, well, I think have, manufactured that impression, that idea that Islam is somehow related to violence. So this must, well, so the title of the book, or the initial impression that your title, I think leads to, and your talk diverge. This is my first observation. And my first question is that, to what extent these two groups, militant Islamists and white nationalists, are similar? If the comparison is exclusively based on victimhood, well, in the case of white nationalists, the victimhood is somehow fictitious than real, right? But when it comes to Islam, I mean, I won't narrow down it to use imperialism. I think we should be talking about Western imperialism, and there's a history of that. So to what extent these two groups are similar enough to be compared? This is my first question. The second question is, to what extent militant Islamism is homegrown? If we take that Western imperialism context as a larger context. So these are my questions. You can call me by my first name, Erdem.
Thank you, Erdem, because that was going to be my first question, is how shall I address you? Yes, so regarding the title, so most certainly there's the word hate with Islam, but it's not Islam, it's Islamist. So how militant Islamists are waging war, of course, there's the white nationalist part before that. But I'm again deliberate with differentiating Islam from Islamist. And there again is a reason why the book is as long as it is, because I take great care to differentiate. So I would perhaps not necessarily push back, but I would just point to maybe a rereading of the title, because I don't use the word Islam, I use Islamist very deliberately. And then I also qualify that with militant, which is again explained in the introduction. With regard to your first question with the victimhood, with the victimhood point of comparison, it's not only victimhood. So the book is separated separated into 4 parts. The last part is the conclusion, but the first two, essentially, the first 2 parts really lay the groundwork for the third part, which is the comparative section. And the reason for that is because we really cannot necessarily understand the comparative and the contrasting of both militant Islamism as an ideology and white nationalism as an ideology without understanding the histories, organizations, and beliefs. So I would, on this point, I would push back and encourage you to even just explore the third part, which is the comparative section, in order to understand that it's not only the sense of victimhood, it's also in terms of the aspirations to do with territory. And I know we've talked about a lot of things today, but that was one point that I mentioned. So it's also, the comparative part is to do with the sense of victimhood. It's to do with the political aims of a territory. It's to do with the commonalities and also differences with perceptions of the United States and what that territory would look like within transnational context. It's to do with the utilization of religious beliefs. Again, not Islam, but the politicization and weaponization of Islamism and militant Islamism in particular. And then within the scope of white nationalist ideology, there are several religions that support racism and also belief system. So it's not to do with a single, the confluence is not on it's not on one point specifically. There are many points, and there are also many divergences. And yes, and you mentioned your second question. I don't know, Dr. Green, if you'd like to. Oh, go ahead, Erdem.
No, I just want to remind of you my second question in case you just you wanted me to repeat, but it's okay if Mr. Green wants to go ahead. Please go ahead.
Well, would you like to repeat it, Erdem? You're
no,
welcome.
yeah. My second question was that how come this militant Islamism, you know, this movement or this specific group is homegrown, right?
So how homegrown is homegrown hate when it comes to militant Islamist ideology?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Green, would you like to take that, and then I can offer my thoughts?
Oh, thanks. You know, I won't speak on Dr. Kamali's behalf in terms of how she's applying the term homegrown to domestic militant Islamism. I'll let her address that on her own. I can only say, broadly speaking, I think, Adam, when you first asked the question, you very much correctly, in my opinion, linked these movements to Western imperialism, right? Which is, in my opinion, the right way to do that, the right way to understand most militant Islamist groups that are targeting either the United States or Western countries, whether they involve individuals who currently reside in the United States or whether they are in other parts of the world. For people who study this, that might seem like an obvious point. I have found in larger political circles in the United States, it's not an obvious point at all. The idea that you can't understand Al-Qaeda apart from United States' involvement in the Soviet-Afghan war is a point lost from the vast majority of politicians in the United States. There's a major denial about this or ignorance about that history, or both. Or that Daesh emerges out of the Iraq war involving an invasion of Iraq that the United States was responsible for destabilizing, that, you know, basically created the atmosphere that generated Daesh. That you basically can't study militant Islamism, particularly violent militant Islamism that's targeting the United States or some other Western countries without understanding Western policies or US policy, and particularly imperialism and the desire to, again, create and maintain a particular global political order that these movements are reacting against. If you read almost any major statement from Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden or from Daesh or Hezbollah, you can go on and on, right? A lot of them explicitly mention imperialism, right? In terms of what they're reacting against. And that link needs to be made clearer and stronger in any book written on the topic and any kind of political discourse we have, but it's not a linkage, in my experience at least, that has filtered into larger political discourse in either Europe or the United States, and that to me is a significant problem.
Imperialism, colonialism, in terms of shaping the worldviews from the perspective of militant Islamists specifically. As we mentioned before, the Crusader Zionist Alliance, for example, there's why I specifically also discuss grievances in terms of location, as well as pieces of political platforms and themes, because, for example, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, are very much seen by many militant Islamists as imperialist minded, as is as is Guantanamo Bay, for example. So there are many issues with that. Thank you. To your second question, the homegrown part of homegrown hate as it relates to militant Islamists specifically is because I'm looking at American citizens and why they're waging war against their nation, their country of citizenship, as do many countries who view Muslims as the quote unquote other, even though they've been there for generations, most instances. And so certainly I would, I think that that understanding that Muslims can be homegrown and are homegrown, not necessarily in terms of hate, but in terms of Islam is also a part of the growth of the United States and is very much homegrown and part and parcel of what it means to be American. So I don't see Islam as a religion that is separate from the American landscape, nor do I see Muslims as outside of the realm of what it means to be American.
We have time for a quick question from Sara.
I'm going to do my best to make it quick, but I have read so far some chapters of your book, and I think it's excellent. I mean, this is one of the first books I have read on this topic, and it's meticulously researched, extremely detailed and comprehensive. So I certainly recommend it to everyone who's interested in learning more about these issues. So I haven't necessarily read all the chapters, but I wanted to read the final chapter because I was really curious in terms of what you suggested about what can be done to counter this threat. And I was a little surprised actually to see empathy being one of the principles of the holistic justice, because as I was reading throughout the book, throughout the chapters, it was quite clear that you adopted this systemic framework to understand the issue and the issue of institutionalized white privilege and injustice. And then reading empathy as a solution to counter this systemic issue felt like it's a passive individual response. So it made me sort of reflect on it and think, to what extent can we really, counter this threat with cultivating empathy? And also more specifically, when we think about the role of the white privileged people in certain power positions, which you also emphasize in the last part of the book, can we really encourage them, or can we really sort of encourage their participation in the systemic change through empathy? Because you also refer to interest convergence theory as you cite Derek Bell's, but I also feel like you are not really persuaded perhaps in terms of which solutions we can adopt to kind of increase this awareness on the part of white privileged people, because that's one of the most critical issues, I think, when it comes to resolving the systemic injustice issues, right? How do we really persuade white privileged people that they have to, sort of not really quit their positions of power, but to really participate in this systemic change, to really admit their own responsibilities, that they also play a role in this? So how do you really see empathy playing a role in this? And is it really, if I may say, realistic, and to what extent, and how can we then employ empathy as a means?
I have a question for you. Why do you think it's the responsibility of marginalized people to push empathy on people who have skin color privilege? You just said that several times. How can we encourage white people to enact empathy? But why do you see it as the job of people of color to encourage?
I don't see it as job of the people of color. No,
okay.
That's not what I meant. Because you employ empathy for everyone, right? You think it's a responsibility for all, for people of color and also for white privileged people. But I think it's especially difficult for people in privileged power positions.
Yes.
Kind of see a benefit for them. Like, why should I have empathy? And you refer to this interest convergence there. They should also share some interest in this. And to me, empathy feels like this very individualistic sort of solution to a systemic problem. Like in social psychology, we also use contact theory for the same thing. If we could resolve the prejudice between people, we would have solved everything, and we wouldn't, like, the inequality would still be there, injustice would still be there, even if we managed to resolve prejudice or interpersonal issues of sort of like fear or hatred. So that's partly what my impression is about. I don't know if it's clear enough, but
no, it is. Yeah, I understand. Empathy seems like a pointless exercise, perhaps.
Not pointless, but at an individual level. I mean, too much at the sort of like interpersonal level. If I have empathy with it, if a white privileged person has empathy with me, how much would that really lead to, a systemic change, or how do we really connect these different levels? Maybe through empathy is part of my question, I think.
Yes, so holistic justice is comprised of not only legislative actions, and also state, and by state, I mean like 50 states of the United States, or whichever institutions take care of education, if we're talking about a global scope, and also grassroots movements. So holistic justice is a call to action for various levels, depending on the positionality of either the individual or the institution. Empathy is specifically employed not only to understand the worldviews of the terrorists themselves, which I discussed at the beginning, but it was also, I bookend the book with empathy because it's very necessary and integral concept in order to employ, as you rightly pointed out, by people of various levels of privilege. Again, based on positionality. And empathy can be activated through education, whether that's learning history. And of course, we're now grappling with that in the United States and around the world post the murder of George Floyd. We're talking about the Tulsa, the massacre of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for example, which some mayors of Tulsa didn't even know. It's not something you necessarily learn about. So I would say that empathy is very much an active concept. It's not something passive that needs to be transmitted or imposed upon. And you're right about interest convergence theory is essentially the concept by Derek Bell that people of privilege, specifically white people, are not going to care about justice issues until it will impact white people themselves, hence the convergence of interest. And that's something that we are grappling with, that we have been grappling with, and most likely that we will be grappling with. I perhaps have a different view that if people with skin color privilege, which in this present moment and for a long time have been white people, if that they actually employed empathy, that nothing would be done. I mean, people essentially create systems. I do talk about and I discuss policies from a systemic level, but then also people very often are like, well, I'm not necessarily engaged, or I don't see myself as part of a system. What can I do? And even if we look at education, there's a reason why there is such a contestation of what is being taught in schools and how it's being taught. It's because it's so critical to our understanding of each other, and really it shapes our empathy for each other, where people should not necessarily just feel relegated as part of communities based on skin color, but as part of interests and across the spectrum of things. So I would say that empathy is very important, and it's going to be difficult. And I'm going to put this to the person on the top of the totem pole here, the white man's perspective here, Dr. Green, who's graciously pointed that out about himself earlier in the talk. And certainly I do talk about white liberal complicity as well, that not only it's been talked about and written about by Malcolm X, by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, for example. So it's not a new concept, but it's certainly something that has essentially crippled our advancement towards equity and justice, certainly. And then whatever Dr. Green, when I'll respond to his comments too. Do you have any follow-up questions though, Dr. Trellock?
Yeah, perhaps it's also the language issue that when I imagine empathy, I think of it as understanding the other person, but not necessarily acting on it, not necessarily doing something with that understanding, not necessarily leveraging that kind of understanding to do something, to take action. Perhaps there could be some language nuance there that I'm not aware of. Thank you for this explanation.
You're welcome. None of these concepts are passive. They're going to have to be active in order. Justice is not a passive concept, nor is it a goal that can be achieved through passivity. There's a reason why silence is equated with complicity, because really there's either do or there is either do good or do harm, essentially. When we're talking about dismantling systems of oppression, you're either working towards dismantling them and instituting and implementing justice at the same time. There's no neutrality, essentially, nor can there be, nor should there be. So I think really what I mean by empathy is employing empathy, is activating empathy. And that's why I use the term activist as well, which sometimes is conflated with terrorism, but the way that I use the term activism is to be active and engaged throughout the process. And really what we can see too is that in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, which we just recently marked the first anniversary of, and in the aftermath of January 6th, which has yet to be grappled with, that people with skin color privilege are just now perhaps grappling with the realities of the concept of race and the weaponization of racism, which we discussed earlier. So while perhaps people who are marginalized and minoritized based on skin color and other types of identities have said, well, these are very real concepts for me, and I'm forced to empathize with people in privilege. Most certainly has not been the case for many people who have various forms of privilege to empathize, whether that's skin color, whether that's socioeconomics, whether that's ability, for example. There are very many forms of privilege where people who have the privilege do not are not engaged, or nor are they compelled to practice empathy until they're forced to do so. So really, if there's one takeaway, that holistic justice is very much an active form of advancing justice. Dr. Green? Empathy?
Empathy, God, wow, big topic.
Is it? How possible is it? And who has the onus, I guess, to instigate empathy when it comes to white skin color privilege?
Well, on the latter part, I always think it's those in the positions of power and privilege that have the onus, they have the burden. Just as I argue many times that, it's those of us who are not Jewish who have the burden of fighting anti-Semitism. Those of us who are not Muslim who have the burden, the moral responsibility to fight Islamophobia. Jews and Muslims fight against those things because they're trying to survive, right? So it's precisely those in positions of power and privilege that have the burden. How do you move them there, right? This is the question of empathy, I think. And this is a hard question, because I agree. I think the conversation is important because, yes, empathy is absolutely essential to an essential ingredient into the larger quest for social justice here. But there are several challenges I don't have the answers to. I debate these in my head, and I debate these with other people too. But individual versus collective empathy, right? Intergroup contact theory can help us explain how an individual can get to empathize with someone of say a different racial background or a different religious background. Does it necessarily translate into systemic change? That's the critique of intergroup contact theory, right? That's hard, right? I know someone who's Jewish. Therefore, I'm less likely to be prejudiced. Yes. Am I therefore going to invest in a system that dismantles anti-Semitism? That's still a larger question that I think we're struggling with, right? And second issue briefly is empathy a precondition for social justice, or is it a byproduct of social justice? I don't have the answer to that question. It is a question, though, right? Do we work for empathy first in order to affect social change? Or do we need to go about trying to create social change through grassroots organizations and movements first, and then empathy comes in time? I'm just reminded of Dr. King, who, one of the things that was different about him versus some of the movements preceding his is that he finally just decided he wasn't going to try to go around and convince enough individual white people to stop being racist in order to try to push for change. He was going to try to push for change, right? Address the systemic nature of discrimination first, upend the Jim Crow laws of the era, and then see what happens in terms of people changing their minds And yes, he was doing a bit of both, right? But in the end, he wasn't waiting for the empathy. He emphasized the change aspect, but empathy was still something that was important to him. And the final thing we have to wrestle with, I just think, is grappling with the reality that a lot of politicians and organizations and movements on both sides of the Atlantic are incentivized not to be empathetic. If Donald Trump is empathetic towards Muslims, Jews, people of color, immigrants, he doesn't have a political career. His incentive is not to be empathetic, right? And he's not an aberration. You have far-right movements across Europe that again, their very brand is not to empathize, right? And how do we address the question of empathy, not just individually, but collectively in a political environment in which many politicians and political movements, in order to gain and maintain power and to leverage that power, are encouraged not to be empathetic? I don't have the answer to that, right? Other than back to the grassroots organizing in terms of putting pressure on these organizations and these politicians from below, as opposed to waiting for them to become more empathetic. But I do think part of what we're up against is that trying to push back against Trumpism here in the United States is trying to push back against a movement that its very existence depends upon a lack of empathy and encouraging others not to be empathetic to people who basically aren't white and Christian and conservative, and that's a major obstacle we're facing.
And to your second point, Dr. Green, that's really what I bring up too when I'm discussing Dr. King in relation to the letter from a Birmingham jail, because that's essentially what he's talking about with white liberal complicity, which is also what Malcolm X very often discussed, and that's why towards the end of their respective lives, their ideas and thoughts really, I think, merged more than they diverged. And also, Dr. Trellick, also with, holistic justice is not just about empathy, it's also about anti-oppression, which really ties into what Dr. Green was saying at the end. It was essentially an expression of the anti-oppression pillar for holistic justice. And so it's not going to be easy, but it's most definitely necessary. And if we look at the civil rights, civil liberties, people who have fought for justice for decades, if not centuries, essentially it comes down to one certain aspect or element of the advancing justice is going to be for people in positions of power to leverage their power in order to dignify the minoritized as human beings and respect and uplift them.
Thanks a lot for the answers.
Thank you for your question too, and thank you for those wonderful answers. I think we're going to have to draw the event to a close there, just because this conversation could go on forever. I'm aware that there were a few more people that wanted to ask questions, and there are new questions appearing all of the time. If you had a question that we didn't quite have time for, then do look at Dr. Kamali's book. It's called Homegrown Hate: Why White Nationalists and Militant Islamists Are Waging War Against the United States. On the 17th of June, we will have a seminar on the impact of counterterrorism measures on civil society organizations in Nigeria. Do have a look at the ECPS website for more details about that. But for now, I hope you'll join me in extending my thanks to Dr. Kamali and to Dr. Green for giving up their time to be with us here today and for fielding questions so expertly. Thank you to everyone who asked questions too, and for joining in what's been a very lively and rewarding discussion. Otherwise, we'll see you on the 17th of June. So goodbye for now.